Welcome to episode 131 of the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertierra, and before we get into today's episode, we'll be doing our monthly book giveaway. This month's winner is Matt Ligon. Congratulations. You have a choice of one of three books, as usual. This month's choices are, first, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States by Daniel Immerwahr. I haven't had a chance to read this book myself, but a lot of really great historians of the United States, of Latin America, and of U.S. foreign policy have highly recommended it, and it's kind of a history of the different territories which the United States took control of between and that were not incorporated into states, such as the Philippines, Puerto Rico, between the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, and it's gotten really, really rave reviews. So I just decided to put that out there. It's a brand new book. It just came out in the last month or so. The second book that I'm going to put up here as an offer is actually by today's guest, Roel Konijnendijk. The book is called Classical Greek Tactics. And Roel's book is supposedly very good. I'm sure it is very good. I have yet to personally read it, but I know Roel, and as I'm sure you can tell by this episode, Roel knows his stuff. So if you're interested in classical Greek tactics, definitely feel free to pick this one up. And then finally, Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 1971 by Lilian Guerra. I'm about 3/4, if not more, of the way through this book, and it's really, really good and interesting. It's kind of it's a political history, but it's also kind of a cultural and social history of the Cuban 1960s. And it's not just the story of then the government did this. It's how was this policy perceived, how it was actually implemented, what were the social and cultural consequences of that. So it's kind of a social and cultural analysis of that through a really breathtaking amount of research into primary sources, especially contemporary newspapers. I have never read anything this in depth that touches on these sources like this, so it's really blown my mind. So if you're interested in Cuban history, definitely feel free to pick it up. So yeah, if you'd like if you, the listener, would like to be in the running to win a book in the future for our monthly book raffle, please feel free to sign up to be one of our generous patrons over on Patreon. With that said, let's get started.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're talking with Dr. Roel Konijnendijk, who is the Marie Curie Fellow at Leiden University. Roel, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And this time I did get your name right. Finally.
Yes, you did. Well done.
Only took me 2 episodes. Today we're going to be talking about the politics and scholarship of historian Victor Davis Hanson. If you were to explain who Hanson is to those who may not know, how would you sum him up in a nutshell?
So briefly, Victor Davis Hanson is by far the most well-known and influential scholar in my subfield of Greek warfare, and one of the most well-known speakers on the subject of Greek history and Greek warfare in general. But he also happens to be a very prolific right-wing pundit in America, who has been advocating all sorts of right-wing causes for the last 2 decades. And what I want to talk about basically is the way in which those things kind of conflate. Now, Hanson himself is a Californian. He was born and still lives, as far as I know, in Selma, in the San Joaquin Valley in California, where he is a raisin farmer. But he also is a professor in classics who's currently attached to the Hoover Institute. He got his PhD at the University of Stanford, or Stanford University rather. And he has been teaching in Californian colleges and is now attached to the Hoover Institute. And has been publishing all the while, sort of book after book. He's very prolific. He has an enormous list of publications on initially Greek history, Greek warfare, and then on into sort of grand theories about Greek society and Greek history and its connections to the modern day, lessons to be learned from it, and eventually also on more politicized aspects like the state of classical studies in the academy, the state of his state of California, various political questions, the history of warfare and strategy, and all the while sort of integrating his scholarship with various political agendas.
Okay, and so you said he's a major contributor, well, like, that he's a major figure within your subfield of Greek, ancient Greek warfare. Like, what would his trajectory be within that field? What would his, like, what tradition did he, like, promote or represent?
So he brings together, essentially, in his work, and the reason why he's so famous is that he brings together in a very engaging and a very accessible way the tradition on Greek warfare that has been sort of developing in the academy since the middle of the 19th century, with the more newer concept from military history of face of battle studies, where essentially he came into the study of Greek warfare starting out examining the question to what extent essentially agriculture was essential to and shaped the nature of Greek society and warfare. And he eventually developed this into the question of what it was like for Greeks to farm and fight within the specific peculiar conditions of classical Greece, and how that led them to formulate particular forms of warfare and particular ways of organizing and stratifying their society, particular value systems, etc., which he sort of built out and constructed into an overarching holistic idea of, everything about Greek society, everything about classical Greece and the way it worked, the way the society fit together, the way the values that it expressed made sense within the parameters of that environment. So it's about integrating sort of a narrative on agricultural and political history with a narrative of warfare that is very heavily influenced by John Keegan's idea of face of battle studies.
That sounds like, at least intuitively, that sounds like a really interesting and actually good idea and approach.
Yeah, so initially he became very popular for reasons of addressing a very interesting topic in a very engaging way. So his initial work, his PhD thesis called Warfare and Agriculture in Classical Greece, tackled the very interesting question that really hadn't been looked at in detail before, which is how does Greek warfare actually relate to the very important business of subsistence farming that underpins all of the society of all the ancient world, and especially, of course, the Greek case. And later on, his most famous work, no doubt, and the one that's very widely read outside of the academy as well, and is still sort of the pinnacle of what he's known for, is the book that came out in 1989 called The Western Way of War, Infantry Battle in Classical Greece, where he essentially tried to bring this same concept of like the farmer at war, the militiaman at war, and his eagerness, his desire to defend his farm, into a general sort of psychological narrative of what these battles over farmland in the Greek world were like. And this is a very vivid, very lively, very engaging, very evocative description, essentially in detail, a very sort of thick description of what battle was like in the Greek antiquity, which had never been done before in that level of detail. And so it was, of course, it was a very groundbreaking work in that sense, in bringing face of battle to the study of Greek antiquity, which hadn't been done before, even though John Keegan himself said in the Face of Battle in 1976 that the Greek sources would probably offer the possibility of doing this. Hanson basically did that. He made that happen. And he gave us a much more visceral and much more real sense of what fighting in hoplite armor, fighting with spears and shields in the middle of this mass of heavy infantry, what that would have looked like and felt like and sounded like. And his book, in that sense, is has been very important for the field.
And I take it that, I mean, of course, you know, three decades passed. I'm sure there's been some criticisms, but would you say overall his early scholarship holds up?
No. Sorry. So no, that's a very sort of unqualified statement, and I really should qualify that to some extent. His initial work, Warfare and Agriculture, which initially was published in 1983 and it was republished in 1989 or 1998. This was his PhD thesis, and that is fundamentally a good piece of scholarship in many ways, in which he brought together his own expertise as a farmer and his own practical experience with, you know, farming fruit trees and vines, into the question of what it actually meant for a Greek army to try and ravage enemy countryside, which is a very prominent feature of campaign descriptions in the classical Greek sources. So when a Greek army entered an enemy territory, they would start burning the countryside, burning the crops, slashing down vines, cutting down trees, as a way of trying to damage and provoke the enemy. And this has always been assumed as a driving factor in getting Greeks to engage in pitched battles, in sort of big decisive engagements, because they couldn't afford to lose their harvest. They couldn't afford to take the damage that was being done to their crops. They had to march out and prevent it from happening. His argument is that from his own, as I said, from his own practical experience, is that it's actually really hard to destroy crops in the field, especially when they're not ripe yet and they're actually quite green and they're full of water and they won't burn. Trees, especially olive trees, are very hard to kill. They're very hard wood. They don't chop down easily. It takes a lot of time. Destroying vines, most of the time you can destroy the upper parts, essentially the plant itself, but the roots will continue to live and will regrow sprouts very quickly. So he's basically saying that you can't do this. Like, it's not easy to destroy agriculture in this way. And so he had to sort of, as a consequence of that argument, he offered a whole new interpretation of why Greek warfare went the way it went. Why did they even bother to try and slash down or burn down people's crops? And his argument is fundamentally that there was a moral obligation or a very strong moral urge felt by the farmers who made up the armies of these Greek states to march out to defend their land, even when they knew that whatever damage was being done to it wasn't permanent or wasn't crippling. And that in itself is a very strong, compelling argument that connects very nicely the fact that most people in antiquity were farmers and were food producers, with the idea of marching out to fight a pitched battle over the land that is being burned and ravaged. So there is a way in which this is all very elegant and it all seems to make sense. The only trouble is that scholars at the time were already aware of this, and scholars since Hanson have really very heavily sort of emphasized this point, is that pitched battles in open ground were not very common in Greek warfare. They were not the default form of engagement. They were not something that happened every year when an army marched out to fight somebody else. They were quite rare. And as a result of that, like, whatever damage is being done to the countryside, it very rarely was enough to actually compel people to march out and fight. So this argument that he has that this is something that is sort of a moral obligation of small farmers, that has been sort of called into question, especially in light of the fact that there were many other ways for Greeks to wage their wars, including, of course, sieges and ambushes and surprise attacks and naval warfare. All of which have nothing to do necessarily with defending farmland by physically standing on it and telling the enemy to get off. So this whole sort of moral argument behind his theory doesn't really hold water. And we can extend that further to his entire idea that essentially these small farmers made up the army of these Greek city-states, which is fundamental to his argument. Like, in order for farming to be fundamental to the way in which the Greeks fought their wars, the dominant element in these armies has to be these small farmers whose only recourse to defending their land is to band together with all of the people that they regard as their equals, the other small farmers, and to unite together in a sort of solid defense of that farmland, which is the hoplite phalanx and the hoplite battle. But of course, I mean, people already knew at the time, again, and this has been very heavily extended in recent scholarship, especially by Hanson Reis, most hoplites were not small farmers. They were either very wealthy landowners whose vast estates were not worked by the men themselves, but by enslaved people or hired labor. And many others were actually too poor to afford their own farms, and they were just hired workers or specialists from the city who would only be able to afford hoplite armor as a form of sort of engaging in status acquisition within their communities. So a small minority or a small number of the people within those massive hoplite armies would actually be the kind of farmers who, according to Hanson, were the only ones who had an incentive to march out that way and to fight that way. So there are ways in which, you know, his underlying assumptions don't actually work. And so while his integration of an economic argument with a way of war, with a military history, makes sense on the surface and seems very elegant, it actually breaks down when you squint at it a little bit and look at what elements this is actually made up of.
So it sounds like while the essential, let's call it the essential philosophy that underpinned the essential premise that underpinned his approach was correct, it was instinctually correct, the conclusions he reached were fundamentally flawed because a lot of the research along the way was flawed.
Yeah, so I mean, the instinctual connection between farming and warfare, I mean, it isn't necessarily correct as such even. It's much more like it is compelling to us and something that we can discuss and that we can use to inform our thinking, because of course it is very important to recognize that the vast majority of people in antiquity were farmers and were themselves involved in some level and crucially dependent on having that year's harvest brought in. So there's a degree to which he sort of really focuses our view on that and focuses our view on the reality of having to defend that land and what sort of hardships people put themselves through in order to do that. The point at which you can criticize his scholarship is that that's not his idea. He's leaning very heavily on older scholarship, in particular a piece by George Grundy from 1911, where he already described the economic underpinning of Greek warfare in exactly the same terms, but also a greater sense of awareness of other parts of Greek society that aren't necessarily reflected in this model that he sketches, basically saying that only the hoplites mattered, only the landowners mattered, which in practice simply isn't the case. Even in major societies which are very sort of better documented as being sort of heavily dependent on land and agriculture, like for instance Sparta, all the citizens, all the people who had full citizen rights were wealthy landowners. They were not small farmers. They were not people who had to live off the land. They were people who lived off the labor of others. So there are all sorts of ways in which this model essentially just doesn't make sense.
So yeah, so that's definitely a major issue with his approach. Now, before we get into his more recent work, I think it's a good moment to ask what his politics were like at this time.
Yeah, so I mean, early on in his career, even as he was developing the concept that exists throughout his work, that ultimately these Greek states relied on this sort of class of small farmers to create the cooperative systems that eventually resulted in political developments and ultimately culminated in democracy. He's basically saying that throughout his work, and this goes right the way back to his PhD, he's arguing that this class of people, these farmers who were obsessed with defending their farmland, that these are the foundation of like conciliatory parliamentary or conciliatory government and eventually of democracy. This is something that develops over time, but it is ultimately at the time is still relatively tame in the sense that he's simply saying that it is important for any society that wants to develop some kind of conciliatory system of government, some kind of respect for for individual property, some kind of sense of egalitarianism and equal rights. It is important for such a society to have a broad class of people who can agree on what those things mean and why they matter. So fundamentally what he's saying is that in order for a society to develop concepts like individualism, private property, voting rights, things like this, you need to have a broad class of people who can agree with each other about what those things are supposed to mean and who's included in it. Now, of course, he's glossing over the fact that in all Greek societies, this is only the adult male citizens. He doesn't like to talk about slaves in general. He doesn't like to talk about immigrants. He doesn't like to talk about women. He never does. But fundamentally, when he's describing this kind of society, he makes a fair point, which can be characterized as being roughly sort of center, right? I mean, sort of centrist in many ways. It's arguing for the existence in society, or the necessary existence in society, of a broad conservative middle. And that is not necessarily something that that sort of is evidence of very radical political views, except for the fact, of course, that middle, when we're talking about Greek society, is largely imaginary. There isn't really very much of that attested in the sources. There is no such thing as a middle class in classical Greece. There is no way that you could point to a group of people who identified in such a way, in the way that we associate with the sort of rural middle class. There is no such thing. So he is already sort of trying to express and describe his vision of the Greeks in a way that is very informed by his modern ideal of what society ought to be like. And it's very heavily connected, as you find out later in his work, with his idea of how the US came about as a society of equal land-owning citizens, and that this creates this sort of perfect conservative conciliatory system of government and society which follows certain rules and which makes the US in some ways the ultimate heir and guardian of the Greek tradition and the Greek legacy. I mean, that is something that, as I said, it starts to happen from early on, and you see it in his earliest work. You already see it present to some extent, and it starts to gain intensity as he goes. And eventually you have other theories like his concept of the Western way of war, which derives from that same kind of society dominated by a middle class of egalitarian farmers. And then he's already sort of starting to look a little bit like he's overgeneralizing about history. Like he's saying, oh, there's this continuous tradition in the Western world, and only in the Western world, of having society and its way of war being intimately connected in the same way. But this is not necessarily yet relevant to any particular question in the present. So his politics are there and his politics are present, but they are to some extent sort of a centrist conservative notion of what makes the US great, which is not necessarily anything that sort of drives him to sort of comment excessively on current affairs or anything like that.
Yeah, and it does sound a bit like a bit of an idealization of as you were saying, like hinting at the American small farmer in, for example, the 19th century, because I'm reading Eric Foner's Reconstruction right now, and one of the issues that that really, for example, obsessed the politicians of the early Reconstruction was, how do we reconstruct the South but also avoid a small peasant class which basically just produces for itself and doesn't produce for the market. And a lot of the small farmers who produced largely for self-subsistence, they weren't exactly always particularly wealthy, or I mean, it sounds like not just. I don't know enough about the ancient Greek warfare to speak about that, but it definitely does seem like it's also built on the connection is built on a misconception of also American history in the 19th century.
No, absolutely. I mean, his view on these things is very heavily colored, of course, by his own experience and that of his parents and his grandparents, because they were all farmers in the same sort of area of California. So there's a degree to which his worldview is very heavily conditioned by what he knows from his own background. And of course, it is based on an idealized vision of the past. I mean, any kind of vision that sees the US as a country of, generally sort of egalitarian small farmers must be missing some crucial details about exactly what, the founding fathers were like themselves, for instance. So there are ways in which obviously that worldview is already fairly heavily idealized, and it's trying to fit Greece into that mold to some extent, which, as I said, is not actually accurate, as many scholars have since pointed out. Like, there is not actually that much of a sense of a broad agricultural middle within Greek society. I mean, farmers are obviously a very large part of every single Greek society. On the other hand, if you ask Aristotle, they shouldn't even have voting rights. And, if you ask the great Greek thinkers of that period, whom he idolizes, of course, in various ways, they don't think of farmers as being necessarily all that. Their ideal of a citizen is a estate owner, is somebody who's wealthy enough to have, to not have to do the work themselves. Because what the Greeks ultimately idolize is not hard work but leisure, and what they wanted for themselves is not a life of backbreaking labor for the good of their family and their state, but rather a life of comfort in which they could do whatever they wanted. And if they wanted to spend their time with backbreaking labor for their family and the state, then that was their choice. I mean, that was ultimately the life that they desired for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's also that back in that era, given the limitations on technology, it's a lot harder to maintain a life of leisure than it is with all the technology we have today, because even if you had a farm where you produce something fairly, like, that got a fairly good price on the market, that's still a ton of work. You had to do it yourself, and if not, you had to hire people. So I mean, it's
yeah, but this is why I said, like, he likes to gloss over this, but of course the ancients had a perfectly good solution to this, which is enslaving other people. And I mean, this is very fundamental to all Greek societies, and especially places like Athens and Sparta. They run on unfree labor. They run on enslaving other people. And it's a horrible fact of all these narratives about sort of the glorious ancestry of Western civilization like to swipe under the rug, is the fact that all of these ideas come from a society that takes enslaved labor and enslaved people for granted. When somebody like Xenophon describes how to run the estate, he's not even describing how you as the estate owner should be ordering the enslaved people around. He's explaining to you how you can instruct one enslaved person who is your bailiff to instruct the other enslaved people to do the actual work on the farm, so that all you have to do is sort of supervise the works. This is the Greek ideal of what this life should be like, and even the texts that seem to idealize farm work generally seem to idealize the work of supervising the work of others on the farm. And that is something that he doesn't really engage with, of course, because that doesn't fit his idea of what these kind of situations are like. It doesn't fit his idea of what the hardworking, proud, self-sufficient middle classes of the world are like. And it doesn't fit his ideal of that class in society being sort of satisfied, being happy to be in the middle rather than being too rich or too poor, like having to look down on both sides, both extremes of the spectrum, and finding themselves comfortably in the middle, where life is hard, but life also has its pleasures, and life also has its pride, and it has its achievements. It is a very idealized picture. It's an idealized picture that gets questioned in every particular by more modern scholarship, because it doesn't really apply to the Greeks. And whether it applies any more to the history of the United States, I mean, I am no expert on that topic, but I would say, like, it wouldn't surprise me if it didn't. It is very clearly based on Hanson's own personal experience and on his own desire to imagine a perfect society that way, and to believe that a society can only develop in good ways if it is organized in that way. But that is obviously, it may never have been a reality. It certainly isn't in ancient Greece, and probably was never in certainly not the whole of the US, but maybe not even in any part of the US either.
And I mean, it's easy to take pot shots, but it's also really, I mean, it is a recurring problem in historiography, and it takes different forms in different fields, but of the fact that we tend to always read the past with the blinders of our contemporary life and assume and project into the past many of the norms and expectations of present actors. It's very easy to attribute a reasoning to a past historical figure or actor based on what we would consider to be right if we were in their shoes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, Hanson obviously does this more and more as he goes along, and in recent decades it's done very little that wasn't that in one way or another. Or at least, and that's the alternative, turning it around and saying that the ancients would have known what to do if they were in our position, which is kind of another way of saying the same thing. I don't really recognize that as being very methodologically different. But in any case, the point is that it is very clearly from the outset, even though it is based on his initial work, his PhD and the Western Way of War, is to some extent based on a very good, sound methodology of practical experience matched with very, very keen and very in-depth knowledge of the source material. I mean, his reading is very wide and his reading is very detailed. I mean, he knows the classical sources better than I do, better than I ever will. On the other hand, reading all that from a very particular perspective in which only certain conclusions are essentially tolerated and a great deal of information is deliberately left by the wayside. And that is something that he has in common really with the previous century and a half of scholarship on Greek warfare, which always did this, which always reduced Greek warfare to this very particular thing of the clash between two heavily armored masses of heavy infantry. That is something that they always thought of, or they always presented as the key feature of Greek warfare and the feature to be explained because it didn't make sense. Why would these Greeks come together in these wasteful, seemingly absurdly stylized clashes, ritualized set-piece battles over their farms all the time when there were so many other ways in which they could have fought? But the reason why we ask ourselves that question, and the reason why George Grundy, that I mentioned before, early in the 20th century posed himself the question of this paradox of Greek warfare, is that it isn't real. They didn't fight their wars like that. They only occasionally actually fought in that very restricted fashion, and most of the time they were perfectly willing to consider and very clearly did use other methods in order to try and beat each other in war. So there is a degree to which the entire system that Hanson tries to build still, since Grundy and for the ensuing 3 generations, it is still based on the idea of trying to justify something that isn't actually there, something, a self-imposed paradox. And Hanson does it with more flair and more detail than pretty much anyone else before him, but he's still in the same sort of slightly, misguided project of trying to justify a world or trying to legitimize a position that is artificial, that isn't really there.
So I think listeners now have a fairly good idea of who Hanson is as a scholar and especially his early works. But as we were discussing right before we began the interview, he also then kind of, I guess in the 1990s and early 2000s, he kind of turns in terms of both both in terms of what work he was producing, who he was producing the work for, and in his political conceptions, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's an interesting thing that you can trace through his works where he essentially, once he's well established as a scholar, which happens sort of at the late 80s, early 90s, when he becomes known as the man on Greek warfare, and he is for at least the entire 90s, there is no one, no single expert in the world who is better known or more respected than Hanson. And his views as expressed in the Western Way of War in particular, I mean, it reached an enormous audience, but also within the Academy, this was the book you read. And the edited volume that followed on that, which was called Hoplites, which brought together a number of other scholars who were all experts in their own right. This is the defining work of the time It appeared in 1991, and for the entire period, all the way down to when I started studying Greek warfare in the early 2000s, this was the first book you read. And it was absolutely the book that set the sort of the benchmark for what the study of Greek warfare was about, and what kind of questions it was asking, and what kind of views were considered to be de rigueur. Once that's established, I mean, Hanson's final work that can be said to be an original contribution to scholarly research based on his own private research into and asking new questions of the sources came out in 1995. He wrote a book called The Other Greeks, The Agrarian Roots of Western Civilization, which is the title. And you can already tell from this title that he's doubling down on a couple of themes that I've tried to already highlight in his earlier work. He's trying to argue more comprehensively and more structurally this time that there is this connection between agrarianism and the rise of values that he identifies as both Greek and Western and American. And that continuity is essentially becomes the founding and core drive of his entire career, is to prove and assert and spread the idea that this continuity exists. So he fundamentally turns away from trying to sort of do very serious and detailed and conscientious research into primary sources and publish in academic journals and things like this, into essentially writing books that restate this point in various ways for various within various contexts, and in an ever sort of wider spiraling field of surrounding topics that are being sort of dragged into it, laid out for comparison, or presented in a way such as to demonstrate this single continuity which he believes to be ever present, this connection between agrarianism and its way of war, that rises first in Greece and then continues right the way through all aspects of what he considers to be Western civilization down to the modern United States, which is the ultimate heir of this tradition and which must now continue the legacy of this connection, of this core. And it's very interesting to see that his as he starts to sort of focus his career more and more on publishing on and around that idea, that Western way of war concept, his politics also start to sort of come out more, and he starts to become more active on various political levels. So in 1998, he publishes a book with his friend John Heath called Who Killed Homer, in which he specifically questions the way in which classics is taught in the academy in the United States, which is a very, very political book. It's a very controversial book. That is to say, basically everybody who read it in academia thought it was terrible and unbelievable that it was even published. But it fits into a narrative which is not something that is very much active in academia, but just outside it, in which essentially the idea is that the intellectual elite in the US is dominated by particular very heavily ideological and politicized interests, which serve to essentially hollow out American culture from the inside. And his contribution to that particular debate is on saying how that affects the classics. And he's clearly affected essentially by the fact that people are wary of his large narrative. People are resisting his grand idea that this is all connected and there's this grand continuity of Western civilization. People are questioning his definitions of Western and Eastern, of ways of war, of agricultural societies. People are questioning every aspect of middle classes, of infantry battle, all these things that he sees as the unquestionable foundations of his theory. And his response to that is to say, look, you're just doing it wrong. You're not willing to ask big questions. You're not willing to teach in ways that people find actually interesting. You're not willing to reach out to people and talk to them about things that matter to them. You are a bunch of ivory tower elitists who only take advantage of a system that was created for you on the backs of, farmers and warriors, which are his ideal citizens, in order to criticize that system from the inside. But you actually have every possible benefit from it, and you're just wasting your time on obscurantism in academic journals that nobody can read, and you've completely lost your way. And this is why people don't read the classics anymore. Right? It's fundamentally his argument. And at that point, you can see that he's starting to drift away from from being the traditional kind of scholar that he initially sort of seems to have set out to be. And as I said, he has no further original contributions to scholarship after this point. He has a couple of historiographical overviews, historiographical chapters, so he keeps on reading the material that comes out. But he's increasingly, he's very heavily prejudiced against things like French scholarship that is heavily informed by theory, informed by literary criticism, informed by postmodernism. He considers this to be the absolute blight on academia. He's very heavily opposed to any kind of sort of over-specialization. He's very much into sort of building grand narratives and making things sort of attractive and relevant to general audiences. And so that is the life of this, that is the kind of scholar that he becomes. He very much ends up digging into that. And as he does so, he also starts to become much more politically active. And we see him changing from this old sort of traditional idealized centrism about what America is supposed to be into an ever more radical sense that America is changing, and is changing for the worse under influences that are both on the inside, as I said, the academy and its weird French influenced leftism, and on the other side, from the outside, essentially, from the arrival of large numbers of people from cultures that are not, in his view, Western. And this is where he really starts to radicalize quite quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s.
To be clear, when you say, for example, French, I guess two clarifications. When you say French contributions, I assume for historiography that would be things like the Annales School, Bloch, Braudel, that kind of thing, right?
No, actually, interestingly, he's not talking about the grand narratives of the Annales School or of ecological history or anything like that. He's specifically referring to the methodologies that are picked up in the 70s from people like, it goes from Sartre, Derrida, Foucault, all these people that are almost always now cited in basically anything that takes itself seriously when it's talking about ideology or discourse or textual criticism or source criticism or power structures. All of these works that essentially try to problematize the kind of text that he thinks should be essentially taken as a sort of eternal authority on morality, politics, and the way in which you should behave as a citizen. So he defends himself against, he calls it sort of French postmodernist theory, which is obviously a sort of facile way of trying to sketch it in a very simplified way, sort of putting it in a corner, putting it in a box. But it is a wide range of the usual suspects when it comes to criticism of the academy.
And yeah, I think on one of our previous episodes, we even had a discussion about how there are a lot of French thinkers who are accused of postmodern. At least I think I remember we talked about this at some point, that there were a lot of French thinkers who were accused of being postmodernists, but actually they weren't postmodernists at all. And some of them had some very deep contradictions with postmodernists. So that's actually a very good clarification. And another point to clarify is, and you would be a very good authority to ask on this, the topic of the West keeps coming up. So, how does Hanson define the West? Does he define the West? And do you think that that's a coherent concept?
Hanson actually spends quite a lot of time trying to define what he means by it, but it's always in slogans, it's always in concepts. Obviously, his concept of the West is untenable because it doesn't concretely define any particular space or allow for that continuity to make rational sense. It's much more about aligning together such societies as he thinks fit his model, essentially. So it is about saying that whatever it was the Greeks invented, the Romans took it over. From there, it was the Christian church that spread it through Northern Europe. And from Northern Europe, it spread to the colonies. And from there, it was basically established as the foundation of societies like America, Canada, Australia. That is fundamentally the narrative that he sketches. And how he defines that West is fundamentally, as I said, by the values that were supposedly derived from Greek social and political thinking. So it's values like respect for property, it's values like political egalitarianism, it's values like individualism, rationalism, Capitalism starts to appear among it, and in some places he also thinks that the private ownership of weapons somehow ends up being suddenly a fundamental feature of Western civilization. But the key point to him, and the key point in his work, especially later on, is that he really, really doubles and triples down on this over and over again, that every single aspect of what he considers to be Western civilization comes from the Greeks. It is something that the Greeks invented, it was perfect from the outset, and it has only been handed down to us. We have not been able to do anything about it. It is only there for us to use and respect and admire. And that's it. It's the finality of human achievement. All we can do is bask in the glory. And this kind of explains why he's so heavily sort of defensive towards and aggressively sort of attacks as well these alternative new forms of academic interpretation, like this thing that he describes as leftist, postmodernist, or French thought, by which he means also things like feminism, feminist theory, ethnic angles on the sources, gender theory, anything else that, you know, detracts from this narrative of these are the great works of civilization, these are the great works of classical scholarship, and we need to just read them and admire them and just look at them in awe, instead of criticizing them for what they leave out, criticizing them for what they underreport, criticizing them for what they repress actively, and essentially trying to construct narratives of the past that more people feel like they are able to relate to in some way, and that offer a better sense or more balanced sense of what older civilizations were like and how they treated people.
Interesting. It sounds like it's definitely a reaction to a lot of changes, broader changes in how history was being studied and written in the last couple of decades. So, I mean, we've been kind of building up to this point, but now I guess we do probably have to talk about his, even more explicitly, his turn as a pundit over the past, what would you say, 20 years or so?
Yeah, so I mean, like he started as a pundit in 2001, which is the same time that another book of his came out, which is essentially a reaction to his first book, Who Killed Homer. He published a second book, which is essentially a collection of articles by him, John Heath, and Bruce Thornton, called Bonfire of the Humanities, which is a much more aggressive attack on anything that they consider to be to the detriment of teaching classics in schools or in universities, and the way in which it is done and the way in which they are being criticized for it. And in that book already, he is much more willing to point to exactly who he considers to be the enemy. And so, I mean, I listed it here when I took the notes. It's feminist theory, affirmative action, the nihilism of postmodernism, the hypocrisy of scholars who benefit from, the wealth of Western civilization while criticizing it. You know, all of these bogeymen end up being the same kind of, the same group of people, but he becomes much more willing to actively, openly engage in what I can only characterize as raw personal invective. To actually defend his position and to say that he has the solution for the classics as a field, as a discipline, and everybody else is just working to destroy it. And in that light, it's interesting to see how much he tries to essentially live the life of the scholar that he thinks he ought to be, which is at least, you can't blame him for inconsistency, because he does then decide, if I want to be relevant as a scholar, if I want to do classics correctly, I need to engage the public. I need to be outspoken. I need to teach as many people as possible about the things that I've learned and how they matter to them in the questions that they're facing today. And one of the ways that he decides to do this is essentially by becoming a spokesman for neoconservatism, which is, I mean, it's not an unfair assessment of his work to say that, because he's very open about it. And there's even been an academic article published in the International Journal of the Classical Tradition by two authors. I will have to rely on you to pronounce their names, from the University of Santiago de Compostela.
The Neocon Greece.
That's right.
Francisco Javier González Garcia and Pedro López Barja de Quiroga.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I didn't have to embarrass myself with that. So these scholars basically lay out in quite a lot of detail the ties that Hanson has from the outset with neoconservative ideology. And in particular, this is because one of the founding figures of neoconservatism as it existed in the late 90s and early 2000s was another scholar of Greek history called Donald Kagan, who is also the father of two of its main spokespeople of the think tank, the Project for a New American Century. So the ties to this are very clear, and the extent to which Donald Kagan wished to be essentially the conservatives' pet classicist or pet Greek historian is something that was transferred over to Hanson. So he came to aspire to the idea that he could be a political pundit from the position of his authority as an expert on classical Greece, and not just on its society and politics, but of course especially on warfare. So he became this, he got a byline with the National Review, which he started in 2001, and throughout the Bush administration, essentially right down to 2010, he was one of the most vocal and consistent proponents of neoconservative policy as expounded by the Bush administration. So he was repeatedly asked to advise on Pentagon policy. He was brought in to be essentially their number one guy in the academy. But he was constantly advocating. He was constantly saying, spouting the party line with regard to this international policy. Including very vocally supporting the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, maintaining right down to a publication that came out in 2010 that really the invasion of Iraq had been a resounding success, that Iraq was now the most peaceful and prosperous democracy in the region. So very clearly using also his academic publications in order to push and to justify his political agenda of essentially supporting neoconservatism. And this is obviously because at that time there was a way in which these politics were starting to merge with the other political issues that have already brought up as being sort of relevant to him personally and academically. These movements of, resistance to a perceived leftist takeover in academia, the resistance to a perceived invasion by immigrants from the southern border, other issues that started to become heavily intertwined with conservative policy in the United States. And so he basically decided to embody this kind of voice within academia and to become a very, very active and very prolific pundit in favor of various right-wing policies.
So it sounds like, doesn't he, from what you're saying, he even had a predecessor in this? What was his name? Kagan?
Kagan, yeah, Donald Kagan. Not to be confused with John Keegan, who is a famous military historian, although he was also, he also wrote for the National Review, but he was British. So Donald Kagan, but he was not vocal in the same way, was not prolific in the same way, but he very clearly also decided to make his mark on politics through his authority as a scholar by founding this Project for a New American Century, this think tank, by being a signatory to various letters written to the Bush administration and to the public, vouching for neoconservative policies, and even by using his works in various ways to push ultimately the interventionist argument in modern politics by interpreting ancient sources, Thucydides, political narratives, and political philosophy in a way that could be used to justify interventionist policies.
Hanson still writes, but I don't think he's as popular as he was maybe a decade ago. Would that be right?
Yeah. So I think it is fairly widely recognized that Hanson has, to coin a phrase, gone off the deep end. The problem with his work is that, as I said, it became more and more obvious that he was using his interpretation of history to push certain political agendas during the Bush administration, and that he was increasingly willing to make pronouncements and to write authoritatively on various subjects with the intention of making his political points, pushing his political agendas. And this is particularly apparent in books like, he wrote a book on the Peloponnesian War called A War Like No Other, which, while on the one hand is a face of battle study of the Peloponnesian War, which has a lot of really interesting bits that, a casual reader might like as an introduction to this conflict, also ultimately pushes the idea that, there are parallels between America and Athens, and there are ways in which Athens could learn from the ways in which Athens mishandled the conflict and ultimately lost the war. There are ways in which he uses every opportunity to write about modern politics. And he says, he makes no apologies. He says scholars might frown on this, but readers will enjoy it. By which he means to say, I'm not writing for you up in the ivory tower, I'm writing here for the gallery, because they actually lap it up. They love it. They want to know that this stuff matters to them in the real world, in the current world. And he starts to write books in which he tries to reach across the ages to prove his points about the way in which middle-class agrarian cultures have a very strong, very decisive way of warfare with which they defend their liberties. And he starts to imagine that in different parts of human history, in ways in which the West, in a sense, has always defended its freedoms in the same very aggressive, very forceful way. And that is how he likes to see history. He's written books like The Father of Us All, a series of essays on battle, or Carnage and Culture, which is specifically about how Western military technology, as a product of Western values like rationalism and egalitarian thinking, is objectively superior to all the other forms of warfare. These kind of ways of looking at the past have brought against him a vast amount of criticism simply because he's not an expert on those fields. He doesn't really know them nearly as well as Greek warfare as a field of study, and he is widely regarded by experts in those other fields to not really know what he's talking about. Now, of course, by now, we also have seen over the last 2 decades a vast change in the way that we perceive Greek warfare, thanks to a number of scholars who have been active on this for a couple of decades, such as Peter Krentz, Hans van Wees, John Dayton, and arguably myself, if I may credit myself with some influence, although my work has only started coming out over the last couple of years. But I'm contributing also in my own small way to a growing body of scholarship that is seeking to attack in detail the kind of model of Greek warfare of which Hanson is by far the most famous and influential proponent. And so at this point, we would even say, and on Ask Historians, this is one of the first questions that I answered in detail. Even experts on Greek warfare don't think that Hanson is speaking authoritatively on his own subject. And so he has lost basically all of his academic credentials now over time from within the academy. But outside the academy, obviously, he still has an enormous readership, and some of his books are some of the first ones that you'll encounter if you want to look into any of these fields. That is something that we still have to deal with to some extent.
Here's a question. Do you think that, his more political work for a wider audience, obviously, I think the listeners can tell you do not particularly think highly of it. And you had some criticisms of his work, his past work and his past scholarship. Do you think that there is much to be gained by reading his older works now? You said it was a staple for a long time, like a go-to book in universities. Or would you say that it's not even good as a counterpoint? Or would you say it's good as a counterpoint to what newer scholarship that's coming out?
Well, so this is the interesting question when it comes to something that has been published. Obviously, it's been published a long time ago now, 3 decades ago, and has garnered an enormous scholarly response that, even regardless of the political response to his punditry, it has garnered an enormous academic response. That means that we no longer really believe a lot of the things that he said. And so there is a degree to which you might say, he's now, even the works that he did that were initially sort of based on solid research that earned him a PhD, that earned him a very strong prominence in Greek warfare studies, these works are now sort of historiographical artifacts. They can be read to get an understanding of the growth of the field. They don't represent the state of the art. Obviously, it is important, nevertheless, to read him because he is the most succinct and probably most accessible and most engaging proponent of a view that was really dominant in the entire academic subfield of Greek warfare for more than 100 years. So there are ways in which reading him is beneficial simply because you can then forego reading a lot of the other works unless you really want to know where those ideas come from. So he, in a way, represents the sort of end point, the culmination of a long tradition of Greek warfare studies that ultimately all fell into the same kind of traps, and that we're only now trying to correct, coming at this from a very different perspective. So that is one way in which you could read his work. On the other hand, I mean, one thing that I really do want to point out is that he has been from the beginning a sloppy scholar. He makes mistakes, he misattributes sources, his source references are often broken, they don't refer to where they're supposed to. He deliberately doesn't engage with a number of sources because, as I said, or aspects of scholarship, because, as I said, he regards them as inherently distrustful and flawed. He is not a very conscientious or careful scholar and never has been. His work has been good because it's been undergirded by good central ideas and by, as I said, a very good, strong, accessible style. And he is, he is on very firm ground when he says, in 2013, when asked to defend himself in a scholarly publication, that his work has an enormous pedigree. So, as I said, it is something that you can read very much as the culmination of a tradition, but not necessarily as even its best expression. And he continues to be like that. I mean, he makes mistakes. He makes errors of spelling, errors of reference, errors of attribution throughout all of his works, because he produces a lot. He doesn't produce it necessarily that carefully, at least when you speak of anything that was published since the late 80s, say. So that is one aspect. And the other aspect, which the article that we mentioned, Neocon Greece, which appeared in 2013, it tried to make the point, and it makes the argument fairly convincing for the time in which it was written, that his work has never been free of some political bias. His work has never been free of an attempt to push a certain ideology. And that ideology is in itself arguably harmful. And so when we're talking about an ideology that is fundamentally about an idealized picture of the American past based in middle-class agrarian soldier citizens, this is something that we could sort of discard as an idyll, essentially, as something that he just likes to believe was true. But it boils down to him saying that there is a particular way of running your society that is the best way, and that has proven throughout history to be better than the ways of others, which he extends. And helpfully, you don't have to do this for him and say, isn't that what you mean? Because he helpfully does it throughout his own work, where he gradually escalates this into a very clearly and unambiguously white supremacist argument that Western civilization is better than others and has to be defended against others, if necessary, with aggressive wars and preventive wars, which eventually will involve, committing massive violence against others because they may pose a threat to these values that he considers to be the foundation of all that's good in the world. He also advocates, and increasingly has started to advocate, things like closing the borders, deporting immigrants, all sorts of measures that are designed to, what he believes to be, preserve what he conceives of as Western civilization and its merits by aggressively excluding anybody from a different culture. And ultimately that, of course, carries the implication that people from a different culture are somehow inherently different. And, that will always be to the detriment of the culture that exists. And so there is a way in which any kind of work that even carries the seeds of this ideology, that carries the ideas in it, can be argued to be, to some extent, a harmful influence. Now, I'm not going to try and argue that all of the work that has come since then is entirely free of such ideology. Of course, we are all, to some extent, beholden to a paradigm in which we believe there is such a thing as Greek and Western civilization, and we use this willy-nilly to some extent to justify what we're doing, or to define what we're doing, or to define ourselves against what we're doing. But there is a degree to which you could say that all of his work is tainted by his later weaponizing his ideas, and the seeds are clearly there from the beginning.
Yeah, it's a bit meta to have a conversation about the role of ideology in discussing the work of another historian, because in the end, I mean, he embarked on trying to popularize his ideas and the implications that he drew from his study of ancient texts and his own, vision of history and his own political perspective and his own political ideology. We are also popularizing history, and there are a lot of popularizers out there. Popularizing history in and of itself isn't wrong. For one of the things that, you're more familiar with Hanson's work than I am, but one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of these a lot of figures who lean more neoconservative tend to do is the erasing of their ideology and their attempt to basically present their ideas as obvious, true, and neutral, as opposed to a perspective that is informed by a very clear ideology in addition to their methodology.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism of a lot of scholarship in that vein. Although, I have to say, we obviously engage in a lot of popularizing history as well, and I don't mean to come across as saying that is somehow a bad thing. What he's arguing is that this is what a lot of scholars should be doing a lot more, and I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing either. He argues that fundamentally the purpose of classicists is to teach the classics to anyone who would be interested in that, and in order to proselytize, and in order to gain, as he calls them, converts to an interest in the classical Greeks or in the ancient Greeks in general. It is sometimes necessary to reach out to people where they are and to try and appeal to them with interpretations that may not be entirely academically justifiable. So there are ways in which you can make that argument, of course. And there are ways in which we kind of make that argument every day, because we are active on Ask Historians, where people can ask questions that we may or may not like or may not think are valid, but we try to answer them in order to respond to the questions that people actually have, rather than telling them what questions they should be asking us. So there is a degree to which, obviously, what he's doing there is very justifiable and is something that we all do as well. The question is whether it is a valid thing, or whether it is a justifiable thing to use that opportunity, to use the authority that he has as a professor, or that other academics have as recognized and certified experts, to push a certain very clear and very unambiguous political agenda, which is not an agenda meant to essentially include and advertise and embrace the study of history in all its particulars, but rather a way to, as I said, weaponize the past in order to enforce modern policy, in order to engage in the shaping of public opinion for the sake of certain political movements. And obviously, Trump has forfeited a lot of whatever support he had left among academics and possibly centrist and left-wing thinkers when, in 2016, he put his weight behind Donald Trump. And he has been a very fervent advocate of Trump's policies ever since. And you can imagine where that comes from, because he fundamentally identifies himself in the same way that, as I understand it, a lot of Trump supporters identify themselves as anti-elitist, anti-immigrant, anti-diversity, anti-postmodernist, in many ways identifying themselves against the exact forces that Hanson has spent at least 2 decades trying to identify as essentially the rot within the Western civilization that he so admires. And so there are many ways in which
the way in which he has ended up using his expertise as a scholar is not to, continue to build this in an academically honest way and to try and find whatever lessons may be found that may be relevant to a readership, as many scholars do, and to answer people's actual questions, but rather to impose upon his readers again and again a very particular mindset about what American foreign policy and American domestic policy ought to be. And that this is very often a policy that aligns with the American right, is not necessarily something that we should be condemning as such. Of course, there are people of all political spectrums who have all sorts of policy ideas, but it is a way in which he is trying to enforce and justify a view of history or an interpretation of history that necessarily excludes, necessarily limits, necessarily increases the aggressive and assertive self-defense of perceived community that is increasingly exclusive of others, and one that doesn't engage honestly with its critics. And that is also something that is very defining of his work over the last 2 decades, is that he doesn't engage in good faith with the people who he is criticizing, with the people and groups that he is excluding from and defining as enemies of his Western civilization. So there are ways in which you can do this outreach, ways in which you can do this sort of academic speaking to a broader audience that are, honest, that are staying within the field in which you are an expert, and that are using the knowledge that you have built up in order to meet people where they are and try to engage them with the material that you are so fascinated by. And then there is essentially using your pulpit, using your platform to shove down people's throats what you believe to be the right opinion, and to try and silence everybody who doesn't agree with you. Which is actively something that he has done on many occasions, and even at book length, essentially trying to silence his critics, trying to attack people who he regards as being his personal opponents, and the opponents as such of all that he admires and stands for. So there are many ways in which the ways that he does this, I think, are not justifiable and not in any sense comparable to the kind of things that other scholars do in order to engage with wider audiences.
Yeah, it sounds like the difference is that you have the role of the public intellectual, and public intellectuals always have their own ideology, their own perspective, their own flaws, their own biases, whatever you want to call it. But a public intellectual is supposed to be somebody who brings their expertise into the public sphere, but is a sincere and open thinker, as opposed to merely a pundit whose role is to make as strong as possible an argument for X without necessarily being open to the same discussion and recognition of criticisms and things like that. Would you say that that's a fair differentiation?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the kind of differentiation that we're talking about here, where specifically many of his critics have pointed out that his own way of taking up a position about what his job is meant to be is incredibly reductive of what he does, even. That there are critics of his, like fairly recently in Sententia Antiquae, a blog about classics and the teaching of classics, there was a piece that specifically argued that the way in which he believed classics to be to need to reinvent itself, to need to survive, was by sort of reducing it to the canonized promulgation of a couple of texts that were not necessarily, that don't represent the full range of what we can do, and that don't represent the full range of views and interpretations that we might give them, specifically because they align more with what he thinks that way. And it is easier for him to keep, to manage essentially the viewpoints that can be extrapolated from that material. So he is not just engaging in trying to reduce his audience's understanding of history by giving that very slanted, very biased perspective on it every time, and deliberately ignoring and deliberately downplaying and even deliberately discrediting alternative interpretation. But he's actively trying to reduce his own field so that nobody else can do that kind of stuff either. And so in that sense, there is very clear distinction between somebody who goes out and says, this is the thing that I have researched and this is why I think it matters, and then engages in a public debate, versus a person like Hanson, who basically takes his authority as a scholar on a particular field where he's not even any longer much of an authority these days, and uses it to bash people over the head with one particular interpretation, which he will constantly argue to be the only valid one.
Yeah, which is also not how academia works. So, yeah. So, perfect. So I think that we've got a pretty good, let's say, introduction to the work of Victor Davis Hanson as a historian and as a pundit. So I'd like to thank you again for coming on and for sharing your perspectives and your expertise on Hanson.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.